Hi, this is the second video of the final sprint for Game Engine. So I just wanted to real quick look at the main function because I didn't get a chance to last video. I forgot. As we can see, there's nothing in it basically. It's just run engine, and that's how the game starts. So I've stripped the things away that were getting called there. And they're called in the scene files now. Okay. So in this video I want to look at the managers for the assets. These deal with loading the assets as well as giving the assets to the player in the game. Here we see the get method, the load method, unload, get instance for the default sprite. I made this a method because it makes it easier for the player to access it, and that means that the player is actually going to be, at least able to be aware that that's there, rather than having to type in the string in the get function. They can just call this function and it returns the default sprite. And that default sprite is placed in the default constructor. It's called in the get instance. So, woo singletons. Anyway, now we'll look at the .cpp, and as we can see, it's very basic. Get obviously just finds the object or the model in the unordered map, and then asserts that it's not at the end, so making sure that we've actually found it, and then returns it. Now, this is actually a great place to tell you why I used unordered maps. I used unordered maps because I didn't really feel like we needed order to the assets, and also because it allows matching up a string and a pointer to an asset up in one. So that way users can use a string to define what they want to call this, and then they can use that same string to pull it up later, thus just making it easier for them. And that is the same for all the managers. They all use unordered maps of a string and whatever their asset is, whether it be an image, a shader, a texture. So now we'll look at the load function. This is called in the load resources. As we can see, brings in the name and the file name. It makes sure that it's not in the list of assets already, and then if it's not in the assets already, it puts it in with the name, creates a new model with the file name, outputs to debug. File name was loaded. Now unload all, very simple delete method. It just goes through all of the assets and deletes them, and outputs models were unloaded. Same thing for shader. The shader, texture, and model manager are virtually the same. The only difference is in the shader we have a default sprite shader, and the name of the unordered map as well as the objects that they contain. Now I'll show you these so you can get a good look. Sprite manager is where it gets a little bit different, because sprites can't just be loaded in right out. They need to have a texture first. So here's the .cpp or the .h for that. It's almost exactly the same. The only difference really for sprites is in the load method, loading them in, which we'll see in the resources. It has to be done after you've already loaded in the texture for it. And instead of inputting a file name, you input the texture name, and searches to make sure the sprites aren't there, gets the texture out of the texture manager, puts it into the sprite manager. Yeah. and it says it was loaded. Unload all, same thing. It's just a simple delete method. Texture manager. Once again, exactly like the shader and model manager. The only difference is that this does not have a default texture. We weren't given any default textures, so I never put any in. Now would be a good time to look at the resources manager, though. So this is the resources manager. This is what the player sees. This is the .h for it. It's very simple. It just says unload all on unload resources, load resources, copy constructor equals delete, assignment constructor equals delete, because it is a singleton. Yeah, the instance and the default constructor. So now we go to the resource, the actual load resources method, which is really the only big method in here besides unload resources, which isn't that big at all. It's just right here, and it just calls unload all on all the managers. So now, looking at the .cpp, we can see it's very similar to our Centipede Games loading manager. All you do is you type in the load, the file path, and it loads it into the manager. For sprites, you need to load in the texture, and then later in the load resources, you create the sprite with the sprite manager load, and the X and Y offset on the sprite. Then you start the demo from there and tell the scene manager to, well, actually you tell the scene manager what scene you want to start, then you tell the scene manager to create the scene. Documentation for this is very simple. So I will look at the where's the asset managers. We'll look at the shader manager to start. They all look very much similar. They look pretty much identical, honestly, because they're all very much identical. Very simple documentation. Just gets the default sprite shader, gets the shader object using the given name, default constructor, you know, very, very simple explanations of what the user has to do. So, oh, yeah, Model Manager was hiding up in the corner. Model Manager is my favorite because it was the first one I made. Anyway, it's very simple documentation, but it works for what you need it to do. Nothing fancy. Now, as we can see, you know, we got all the classes here. I'm not going to go through, or I guess I probably should go through all the asset managers, shouldn't I? So we'll go to Sprite Manager, just to show you that, you know, they're all here. They're all pretty much the same. Yeah. Offset, offset. Now what was the last one I'm missing? I'm missing one. I think it's Texture Manager. There it is. Yeah, it was hiding down in there. As we can see, it's very simple, very to the point. My complicated documentation is in the demo, which I will show in a separate video. Yeah, I think I'm going to cut this video off. I've covered the asset managers and the resource manager here. So next we'll go into more scene level and game object stuff. Cool.